It's James Melendez, James the Wine Guy. Thank you for joining me on my podcast for all things on wine, food, travel, other beverages, and lifestyle. I appreciate you spending time with me today. Thank you. James Melendez, James the Wine Guy. Thank you for joining me on my podcast today. This is my inaugural podcast. Very excited to be here. So my podcast is obviously on wine, but I'm also going to talk about food, travel, lifestyle, and other beverages. Ultimately, I'm really wanting to, position this in terms of two parts. One is, obviously the why I'm doing this. And the second part is on research I did on vintage champagne and global climate change. So these are completely different subject matters, but I think they're going to be exciting and interesting. I'm looking forward to presenting my material on vintage champagne and global climate change. Now, I'm already on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. I write for myself on jamesthewineguy.com. Also, I do videos. I have about 2,800 videos on YouTube. And so I thought, do I really need to do a podcast? And there was a lot of things pointing to yes. I thought to myself, maybe I do, because I noticed that all my medias and all my social media presence, the analytics support that I have some crossover, but in general, I definitely have different audiences and different times people, how they consume their content. So for me, I really wanted to, look at that. I did have a nice friend of mine who said, James, you would be a good podcaster. That was a really nice vote of confidence. And then suddenly I started to look at all these data points. One was, the growth of the podcast industry, how many people listen, why people are listening to podcasts. Because in some ways, I always had, that video is a final frontier of content for any particular subject matter. And I think it still is. But there's some nuances and differences in unique behaviors on YouTube, for example, that actually makes that probably even more difficult. Now, podcasts are important because, say, the work environment. The work environment has been really pivotal in how people work. So a lot of people listen to podcasts because of their work environment. That is, they work in an open office environment. And, there's constant interruption. I've worked in that environment in some regards, and, I listen to music, but I can only listen to that so long because I repeat it over and over. And podcast offers an opportunity with so much content to learn something new or to hear something new or something inspiring. And not to really listen into, for me, it's not necessarily white noise. I do my work and I can do my work, and I can also listen to a podcast in addition to that. So I can listen to a podcast at work, I can tune the noise out around me, and I can find something stimulating, interesting to listen to. And I think the work environment is, I would rather hear a smart podcast than somebody chomping and chewing in my ear next to me. Some open environments are really not as open as you like them to be. Sometimes you are assigned a seat in an open environment, which could be, north of difficult, because a true work environment might be where you want to sit, and maybe that's different every single day. So there's that. I also started listening to podcasts in November 2019. If I was really going to think about doing this, I had to listen to other people. I couldn't just start out without knowing some background information. What do other people sound like? What are they talking about? And so it's interesting in some ways. On accident, I found Better Podcasting. It's a fantastic, actually, it's probably one of my favorite podcasts. And it's one that's very, very specific. So if you're into podcasting to create podcasts, it's one to listen to. Pretty long podcast per episode. It's about 45 minutes to an hour, but well worth the investment. So I started listening to the New York Times book review because I very much enjoy the New York Times, both online version as well as our print edition. So I think that New York Times book review is fantastic. I can also look at the interviewing skills of, say, Pamela Paul, the editor, and she's both fantastic in writing as well as being a presenter, interviewer, and something that I thought was just well done. While I don't like every single episode, it's really topical. You're not going to like every episode that I do. You might not listen to it. So I may have a particular podcast that may not be of interest to you, which is fine. I totally don't expect everyone to listen to every single podcast. And so the same thing is with the New York book review, New York Times book review. Now, there are subject matters on there that I don't always agree with the editors. So there's also other editors that Pamela Paul will bring in. And but I do find it just very stimulating because there's so many amazingly smart people and book writers who are on there presenting their material. It's completely thoughtful, and the interviewing skills are fantastic. That's not the case with all podcasts. My next example is Harvard Business Review. While I definitely like their content written and online, I'm not really loving their IdeaCast. So IdeaCast is really supposed to be that podcast extension for the brand itself. It's actually, unlike the New York Times Book Review, where people are writers, editors, and they know their subject matter really well. They actually know other subject matters in terms of maybe it's history or science or current affairs. They're very good at that, where I think Harvard Business Review is less so. I think it's because people who are in the interviewing booth, so to speak, at Harvard Business Review, IdeaCast, they're really looking at in terms of like just the subject matter. I read the book. Here's my comments. Here's my questions, as opposed to coming from a point of view where I love an operating company. I love operational excellence. I like the intricacies of any company or organization and how do you fine tune them to operate even better. So like I would love to be on that to upgrade that myself. And so that's something I think about in terms of as a listener. And so I stopped listening to, I listened to maybe 8 years worth of content. There's about 15 in total. And I thought it's just not getting any better. So I went to specific personalities who were being interviewed. And that's what really was exciting. Other than that, I gave up on the whole series altogether. I did listen to some history podcasts because I thought, okay, I'm going to learn something new. And it turns out that there's very, very few. Actually, I haven't found one that I really like yet. I did find one on history of the Renaissance where I think it's a history writer. I'm not really sure. But it's actually probably not, because I look at my history professors from college, which are exquisitely bright and amazingly good content and, just brilliant knowledge. And when I listened to this particular podcast, I was just not excited about it at all, because this particular podcaster was rereading because they forgot, I guess, what they read. They should have edited what they were producing because it didn't sound genuine. So right now, I'm not reading from a script. I'm actually reading from an outline. I did finally listen to wine podcasts because that's the subject matter that I'm entering into. And what I did find was, people weren't committed to doing it. So there was an irregular production. It stopped suddenly. People stopped doing any sort of podcast publishing. And also the content seemed to be way too specific, either in geography or maybe style or maybe just overall editorial viewpoint. And so to me, you don't have a really depthful way of drilling into the content, then I think you're going to lose listeners. And that's not where I wanted to end up. I think all this research was necessary for me to do. I don't want to repeat, what I find in YouTube, which is the, lack of attention that most people have, not because they have it naturally, it's just because YouTube, the platform, really wants people to click and click and click and click. And that's not possible for everyone. So on average, it depends on the video subject matter, but it's about 1.5 to 2 minutes view time. And I think when I look at podcasts, it's probably slightly longer, if not a lot longer. So if you find somebody you listen to, like some of the podcasts, New York Times, I listened to them from beginning to end because they were that compelling. So podcasting could be something that someone listens to, and also when I think about video, I think there's the belief that you have to watch your video because you're going to miss something. And yes, I get that viewpoint in a way where, sometimes it truly is designed for the visual aspect of it. That while I do my video reviews, maybe there's something that somebody feels they might miss if they don't see it. So I think there's that part. But also podcasts are built for things like travel. People want to, maybe when they're seated and, they have a 5-hour flight, they really want something to listen to beyond music and get something from that. So my vision is to produce podcasts on wine, spirits, actually all beverages, food, travel, lifestyle, and everything on the good life. I'll be on all my podcasts, but I'll occasionally have guests on there. So I think it's really important to find that. I'd like to have it all the time, but it's not always possible. And so again, here we're going to start off with vintage champagne global climate change. So we're going to switch gears altogether. It's a meaty topic, but a good one for this media. So collectively, we take vintage for a given, right? Because most wines, with the exception of champagne, have a vintage. There's a year on them. So vintage champagne is unique, rare, and also something that is sought after. So I think there's something where, you can ask somebody who's not as familiar with wine to think about vintage champagne. That's almost a loaded term, right? People are thinking, something special, something unique. And, that's actually true. Now, the 1942 film Casablanca has a great vintage champagne reference in a scene at Rick's. Claude Rains is Captain Louis Renault, and he says, "May I recommend Veuve Clicquot 26, a good French wine?" And of course, I had to fact check it and find out, was there truly a 26 vintage of Clicquot? The answer is yes, there is. I was really excited about that, simply because not all movie references on wine are correct or accurate. We can think of Sideways, where Chateau Cheval Blanc, the protagonist, is saying he hates Merlot, but somehow he loves this Chateau Cheval Blanc, which is, a considerable portion of this is Merlot. Going back to Casablanca. Casablanca is, shot in World War II in 1942. It's right after Prohibition's end. And you also have the Great Depression. So when I think of this reference point, I'll just hang on this for just a little bit. The screenwriter could have wrote a good champagne. And, that would have probably been understood then and definitely understood now. And maybe a fantastic vintage champagne would be another way of saying that. But it's also, put in the reference point of World War II and Great Depression. So wine was not really at the top of mind for people unless it was really part of your cultural milieu or your cultural experience, where wine was part of your Sunday dinner. So when you look at Casablanca being released in 1942, it's really, the era of the end of Prohibition in the 30s, early 30s. Then you have the end of the Great Depression, approximately 10 years worth of it from 29 to 39. And then you have, the start of the American part of World War II. And in this period of time is austerity. There's a lot of people who don't have a lot of money. And, people obviously would have understood French wine, to the screenwriter's credit. Today, we would prefer probably to hear vintage champagne. A great vintage champagne might be the line as opposed to a good French wine. So that's one way we think of, how we think of movie references in wine today. But it still made, an impression, right? So I was on a flight watching Casablanca and I smiled because I thought that was fantastic. I wish I could have shared that with, my neighbor next to me, but they probably would have thought I was some strange guy sitting next to them. So I chose to just keep it to myself. And truly, it drills back to that vintage wines are very spectacularly cool, rare, and something to be appreciated. Now, and that's even from the casual observer's point of view. I was watching a YouTuber talk about champagne, and I was, really enjoying their content up until the point where, and I'll give this quote directly from them, which is, quote, "But thanks at least in part to global climate change, warmer and milder years are more common in Champagne, and you are seeing more and more vintages being called," unquote. And my thermometer hit. I'm like, really? Seriously? I don't know if that's actually true. I wish it were true. That was actually my immediate gut reaction. First, I'm not sure I would use the words of, that thanks in part to global climate change. I'm not going to thank global climate change for anything, nor should anyone. And so I would never use those words. I was actually kind of like, that's really a strange way of saying it. And I'm not a global climate denier, so I need to point that out as well. But I also have to think about, so Champagne is the northerly frontier of wine production, Vitis vinifera grapes. That is the grapes that are, typical grapes you're going to find in the area, which are Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay. And when I think of global climate change, it's about heat, but it's also about other things too, that the environment, our weather does not stay constant. It's not about a one-for-one heat exchange. It's actually going to be more complex, more weather patterns, wind and hurricane and tornadoes. And you get the idea that it's not just going to be about increased heat. And so, that was my point of where, okay, this doesn't sound accurate. I'm going to see if there's more information. I did a search. Is there more champagnes being declared today than, say, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? And also to give a backgrounder, so I'm going to paraphrase a YouTuber on English wine. We are having English wine simply because of global warming. The presenter was saying that, it's new. It's not happened before. It's because of global climate change. And, I don't know if it was just shorthand. They didn't know what to say. And it was disappointing because that's not true. I did, write them a comment. I did write a comment to the other person, by the way. Didn't get a response from either. But it was one where, there has to be proof before you say things. And I did say that there's been 2 millennia of wine production in England. It's actually, when you're not saying things that are actually helpful, they're harmful because it, leads on to other people saying that, well, if person X said this and person Y said that, it must be true. Well, I'm not going to argue that there is not global climate changes that are happening. It's going to be happening very differently across the way. I read an article in Wired magazine, and it was also picking up on this. It was about 2014, And the writer said, oh, we're going to have Zinfandel from Canada. And I said, well, guess what? We already do. Not a lot, but there are some Zinfandel coming from British Columbia. So these comments just tend to be really not very well informed. They seem to be inaccurate, and I think it's unfortunate. So when I think of champagne, it's less than 1% production per year, and there are some years where there's no vintages at all. That becomes less common as we look towards our time right now in 2020. So while vintage champagne is a very small yearly production of less than 1%, if there is a vintage being called, some years there isn't. But because there are more producers, say now than 100 years ago, there are more vintage wines. Now, there's no specific regulation that says there has to be a specific characteristic or markers for a vintage wine. That's really called upon each producer. Each chef du cave is going to declare a vintage if she or he feels it's a significant vintage, a significant weather year where that vintage should be declared. There is one regulation by Civic, which is the Comité Interprofessionnel des Champagnes, and that's really regarding reserve wines if it is a mixed house, that is vintage, non-vintage wines, and that is a certain portion needs to be saved as a reserve wine. Now, if you look at Champagne Salon, it's a vintage-only house. Therefore, they don't have the requirement of reserve wines. That's just not part of what they do. Overall, the tradition of Champagne is to have reserve wines to have for their non-vintage programs so that their wines are going to be consistent over time. And that's what makes Champagne and uniquely interesting. So that's one call out I definitely want to bring out. Now, again, it's up to the chef du cave to declare what is a vintage wine. Could a chef de cave call a vintage every single year? The answer is yes. However, there's two big major or three reasons why you wouldn't do it. One would be, obviously if it's not going to be vintage quality, it's going to be noted in the trade that is on-premise, off-premise, restaurant or store, retailer. And the other one would be a wine judge or wine reviewer. They're going to note that that particular wine is not a vintage-worthy wine or something that should be called a vintage. And so that's going to be a call out. And obviously that's going to be the fourth category, which is the reputation of the house or the domain. So that's a risk that I think most producers are not going to do. There is one point where I think one producer that I know of has done 9 vintages in a decade, which is really, really unusual. There's more data points out there than I can find on other producers, but there's only one that I can actually point out. Now, I was looking at databases for vintage wines, and it's actually not easy to find. There's really not a great source of information that I can find out there that really gives me all the producers, both the Reclutant Manipulant and Negociant Manipulant producers, RM, and the NM producers. So what I decided to do was to focus in on some of the oldest producers, which ends up being some of the largest producers by that very fact. So I assembled 17 producers, 18 wines altogether. And I think it's a good assembly to look at. So I'm going to name those wines right now in terms of what I did put into my database. So the 17 producers, 18 wines in total. You have Champagne Bollinger RD, and yes, there are several different vintage wines from Champagne Bollinger, but I wanted to include RD because that's one of the longest lineage wines. Canard Duchesne at 4.2 million bottles, so I'm going to give the total production number. Keep in mind that could be vintage and non-vintage, and of course in non-vintage years, they're not going to have that number be at that specific metric. Next is Domaine Perignon Drapier, GH Mum, 7.5 million bottles. Gosset Célébrie, Lanson at 4.2 million bottles. Laurent Perrier at 7.26 million. Louis Roederer Cristal. You have 300,000 to 400,000 of just Cristal on those vintage years, with a total house production of 3.5 million bottles. Nicolas Foyat, Palme d'Or, 10.8 million. Piper Heidsieck Cuvée Rare, 4.3 million bottles. Perrier-Jouy Belle Époque. Paul Roger Winston Churchill Cuvée. Pommery Cuvée Louise, and a total house production of 4.38 million. Champagne Salon, Taittinger Comte de Champagne, 5.5 million bottles. And lastly, you have 2 wines from Clicquot, that is Clicquot Vintage and Clicquot La Grande Dame, 19 million bottles in total. I wanted to use Clicquot twice. So Madame Clicquot was a visionary. She was an innovator. She really elevated, champagne to be what it was. to what it is today, and was really influential in terms of the community by bringing up people to, bringing up the bar in terms of what champagne is and the production methods and so forth. So I really felt it was important to include 2 wines from Veuve Clicquot. And so when I look at the 19th century, there are only 3 producers. Highlighting this because this is not going to be part of my data set. So a big shout out to Clicquot. I did reach out to them and they gave me a citation of all their vintages of Clicquot in the 19th century, and I could not have found that any other way. So I, really appreciate that. There are 2 other producers. You have Perrier-Jouët, and I did reach out to them. I do not know their total production of vintages in the 19th century. Then there is Louis Roederer Cristal, which was made for the court of Tsar Alexander II in 1876. So they didn't release a vintage until 1945. Basically, in the 19th century data, there's not a lot of meaningful information in terms of this particular study of looking at global climate change and vintage champagne, so I did not use that. I do believe that when I think of champagne, while Madame Clicquot was instrumental, you have to think of champagne as, obviously a modern phenomenon, and one could include 1810, when vintage champagne was first released from Clicquot, is that you have this 200-year lineage, and that could be part of modernity. Anyways, it is really a modern phenomenon, especially in the 20th century, and especially in the last half of the 20th century. The first half is really riddled with 2 world wars. You have the Great Depression in the United States and other places around the world. You have a prohibition, and that really eats into what the producers, the domains of Champagne, were doing. They were barely staying alive. They were in the middle of war very often, which was unfortunate. So in those paths of war and destruction, Champagne, depending on the house, depending on the producer, was still producing wines. Now, if you visit the principal city in Champagne today, Reims, a fantastic city to visit, a beautiful cathedral, Notre Dame. You'll see the Musée de la Rendition, which is north of the cathedral, and that means the Museum of the Surrender. So on May 7, 1945, the Germans surrender here in World War II. And that's just, very interesting because you can go outside, you're going to see the Soviet flag still being flown today, probably the only place in the world where it's being flown because they were an ally in terms of the particular war partners or allied partners in World War II. So the top line data is that there are 411 vintages in my study, 17 houses, 18 wines in total. So there are 7 to 64 vintages. 64 is Clicquot, but that includes the total production from the year 1810. And just for the study, I took out the 19th century data and just kept intact the 20th century data, even for Clicquot. So there are 23 vintages per wine label. I'm pointing it out like that because of the 2 Clicquot wines. So in addition to that, my analysis is that there's a vintage every 2.56 years. So that's nearly 4 vintages per decade, which is really truly 3.9 per decade. And you have to round that up because you have to have whole vintages to be a sensible number. Now, you do find in 3-year period, there's only 3 producers that have 100% production of vintage wines. That's year 1921, 28, and 34. And so after 1934, there are no other wines that have 100% vintages per any particular year. So in my heat map of the 411 vintages, when you look at the heat map, I was doing that simply because I needed to assemble the numbers together. So I needed to put together in terms of vintage and each producer. I was hoping there was something, a visual clue or visual viewing that would actually be unique and valuable. As it turns out, there's really nothing helpful in that, but it does show that there are years in the early portion of the first half of the 20th century that there was no production of vintage wines, say in the year 22, 24, 27, 30, 31, 33, 35, 36, 38, 39, 40, 41, 44. I'll stop there. You do see other years beyond that, but that becomes less frequent over time. You can look at that in terms of World War II. You can look at that in terms of, say, there's the Great Depression, and you also have Prohibition. So while you do have wines and spirits and beer that are being imported into the United States illegally for the Prohibition era, it's still being done regardless. Now, the next thing you might want to look at in terms of how do you look at this data? And to look at the data is I charted together all the total vintages all the producers and a gold curve. And the gold curve shows the total vintages possible if all vintages were being produced in any particular year. Now, that's important to look at because those 3 years that I mentioned in terms of those 3 producers having a vintage, they actually show up in the graph. But that doesn't happen any point after that. This curve of vintage by year producer is really important to look at because if those pressures were actually occurring, according to that YouTuber who said there are more vintages because of warmer or more milder years, you would definitely see that, especially because these are some of the largest producers in Champagne of Champagne vintages. And when I look at this, there is no pressure on that whatsoever. In fact, there's really a lot of stability between, say, the years 1990 to the year 2010. And that really is showing that there's nothing reaching the gold curve. The gold curve, remember, is if you reach or even near the gold curve, that means you're in the 80 to 90 percentile range. And that means that you're really getting towards the 100%, which would really give you some pressures to think that activity or that phenomenon is actually occurring. And it is not. So are there any behaviors in the 90s? That is, are there 90% of the producers who have a vintage in any given year? The answer is no. So in the 80 percentile range, there are 4 years, and those are, I'll tell you what they are. They're 1966, 85, 88, and 2004 that are in the mid-80 range and above. So mid-80, so that means from 85 to 89% range. And those are significant. But think about it this way. So you have 66, which is really a unique thing. I was expecting to see that at 100%. It didn't go there based on these particular producers. Now, it doesn't happen in the 1970s. And also, keep in mind, it does not happen in the 1990s. It does happen in the 2000s only once. Curiously, like a bell curve, it happens twice in the 1980s, from 1985 and then again in 1988. So if this particular behavior or more vintages occurring, wouldn't this actually occur in the 2000s? Perhaps you might see this happen 3 times in a decade in the year 2000 to 2010. You do not see that. So the next important graph to look at is you can look at average vintages by decade by producer. And it actually is all over the chart, the line graph itself. You're seeing a lot of activity happening with all producers. And so that's not meaningful to look at. So what I did is I created an average of all the producers to see what that looked like. And then I added on a trend line. So if I took this from 1900 to 2010, getting all this data together, first of all, the trend line is not going to be completely accurate in terms of predicting more vintages. So the trend line is going to go upward. There's no other way for this to go. So there are very few vintages in 1900. You don't really get any until the mid part of the century. And that is actually not going to help you to understand, is there more vintages being released in, say, the last 20, 30 years? And the answer at this point is no. It doesn't really give you that information. It doesn't tell you that. If you look at the average, and you can look at the average in terms of saying, okay, look between the years 1990, which is actually the highest point, about 80%. So look at the 1990s. That percentage of producers on average for the decade is at 80%. So if you're going to see something happen in terms of more vintages being created in modernity, you're going to see that in the 2000s. You're going to see that line, that average actually go up. It does not. It goes from 80% all the way down to 50%. So there's nothing telling us here that we're having more vintages based on the data that I have. Now, if I extend that out to pull in the 2010s, which I'm probably going to have to wait another 5 years to get that data, then you could possibly see that increase or stay the same or go lower. We do not know that yet. My suspicion is it's going to be very similar to the 2000s. So we might be in the 50 to 55% range. But again, I don't have enough data sets. I do have some producers who have released a vintage in the year 2010s, but we don't have enough of that data point. Now, if I pull in and I actually took the data from the 1960s to 2010, the averages, of course, it looks slightly different because I have a different slice of this chart. The average is really going to be the same. It does look slightly different as compared to the total data set. Now, what does look completely different is the trend line. The trend line is actually not on a horizontal plane, it is actually pointing down, slightly downward, and that's because the pressures are showing that there is no increases in this particular point that is actually showing a trend in the upward direction. It's actually the opposite, downward trend. So we're left with the same daunting proposition of Champagne. It is just as unpredictable as it's ever been. There is no indication that we're having more vintages per decade, per year, or any other time. And then if I look at Champagne, Champagne is a challenging region. It's the most northerly region, one of the most northerly. There are several actually. It's at a 49.5 latitude. It's an oceanic climate with a continental accent. And regardless of how you look at that means that the conditions are always difficult regardless. So I decided to look at GDD, which is growing degree days, which is high temperature minus low temperature divided by 2. And then you add all those up for the growing season. And you can see, is there an increase in temperature? And I did see that for other regions, but I didn't see one for Champagne. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that it's not important, but it does not manifest itself in more vintages being produced. My suspicion is if you saw the data, it's not going to show that more vintages being produced based on temperature alone. And I'm not so sure that what the author of that particular YouTube video was saying was actually, again, correct. I can't find anything to corroborate that. And then lastly, if you do have more milder years, that's one thing. But if you have warmer or hot years, that's going to affect Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay. You're going to have less of that. In fact, those pressures are going to really pressure reserve wines to create more non-vintages, and the opposite could be true. You could have less vintage wines over time with global climate change. So 1 for 1 is not equal to 2 in this particular example, as that author suggests. You have complexity, you have dynamical systems that are playing into what Champagne is and how it reacts and what it does over a period of time. So it was fascinating to do. I'm collecting more data. I'm going to be observing this over time. So thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I hope you like the subject matter. I'd like to know your thoughts on this. Questions and comments, you can leave them at james@jamesthewineguy.com. In the meantime, we can connect on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and WordPress. Thank you for your support. Thank you for watching. I look forward to the next show. Stay tuned. Santé. Thank you for stopping by my podcast today. I really do appreciate it. You'll also find me on jamesthewineguy.com, WordPress, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Wishing you all the best. I'll see you on the next podcast. Santé.